So my name is Chris Collier. I'm the Executive Director of Renew Theaters, which manages the Ambler Theater, County Theater, Highway Theater, and Princeton Garden Theater. And I want to thank you for joining us for this, our first Film 101 event of 2021. This is a two-parter, which we're really excited about, and we're thrilled to have Hannah Jack back to lead us through this. Tonight, we'll be discussing the 39 steps, and then next week, next Wednesday, we'll be discussing The Lady Vanishes. So I hope that you all join us next week as well. Just a couple quick notes before we get started. First off, this program is made free to our members by the Vesta Fund, so just wanted to thank them for their support and for overseeing this program. And I do want to thank all of our members, and especially anyone who supported the theaters in our recovery fund efforts. We were absolutely blown away by the amount of support by all of our members and fans this holiday season. And that is going to allow our theaters to definitely reopen this year. We're still working on the timing of that, but absolutely heartened and overwhelmed by all of the support that we saw. So thank you to everyone who is a member and anyone who donated to the theaters this past year in this really challenging time. One of the really exciting things about these virtual Film 101 programs is that it allows us to bring together members from each of our different communities, but also I saw in looking at all the registrations that we have some people from outside our region. So thank you for joining us and for participating in this conversation. Just a quick reminder of Zoom protocols. We request that everyone stay on mute unless speaking. And what we're going to do for questions, because we're anticipating over 100 people on the talk today, is that we're actually going to start the questions in the chat. And Hannah and I will monitor the chat and we'll address questions there. So please fill in any questions that you have in the chat. And then as we get later on into the conversation, we can open it up for general conversation. But definitely want to have it in the chat to start so that we're all not jumping on each other or stepping on each other's toes. I know that Hannah has a bit of a talk to give in the beginning, and then we'll open it up to questions. So she can address when to start filling in that chat box. But if everyone, I'm sure we're all familiar with Zoom by now and know how to use that feature. So that's the majority of my preamble. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Hannah Jack, who's a writer for Turner Classic Movies, and has scripted the introductions for the movies that air on the network, delivered by the TCM hosts Ben Mankiewicz, Dave Karger, and Jacqueline Stewart. Hannah has also written hosted introductions for films on HBO Max, Filmstruck, and classic movies screened in theaters around the country as part of the Fathom Events Big Screen Classic series. We are thrilled to have Hannah back in Bucks County and to say that she's a member of the County Theater. So this is a really wonderful collaboration, and so thrilled to have her leading us through this conversation on Hitchcock. So without further ado, Hannah, show's yours.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. Just can everyone give me a thumbs up if you? Oops. Okay, we're good? Okay, perfect. So thank you so much. Thank you to Chris. Thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. I had such a phenomenal time being with so many of you in December when we talked about The Thin Man. And I'm thrilled to be back to talk about two Hitchcock films as part of this series that we're calling Hitchcock in England. Just to clarify, because I see some questions even are coming up in the chat about this now, that the tonight's talk is going to be focused on the 39 steps. And then next week we will pick up with The Lady Vanishes. I did watch both movies in anticipation of tonight. We'll save the deep dive into The Lady Vanishes for next week and give everyone who hasn't seen that movie a chance to see it in preparation for next week's discussion, which will also be Wednesday at 7:30. So thank you all again for being here. This the focus of Alfred Hitchcock came from the fact that he's just always been one of my favorite directors, and one of the first directors I really sort of dove into his whole body of work. And I think that one of the one of the great things about Hitchcock is that as iconic, as recognizable, as well known as his movies are, he had such a long and robust and fascinating career that there's always more to kind of dig into. His movies are deceptively accessible. There's always something else going on that you can explore, and there's always more about his career that we can talk about that isn't always necessarily the focus. And one of those aspects that I find particularly interesting is the early part of his career. The first 2 of his 6 decades as a filmmaker were spent in England. And so that's the title of this series. We're talking about Hitchcock in England. If we were to do like the opposite talk, we could call it Hitchcock in Hollywood. In 1939 is a year that you could draw a dividing line in his career, if you wanted to break it into 2 phases. Before 1939 is when he was in England working and becoming the Alfred Hitchcock that we think of. And then in 1939, he moved to Hollywood, and most, I would say, of his more famous films came from that era. So what we are doing in this series is taking a look at the 2 most famous, most well-known movies to come out of his England period. And like Chris said, I'm going to kind of talk at you at the beginning of this, and we're going to talk about the sort of trajectory of his career that led to the 39 steps, so that we have some context for kind of where this movie fell in his career. And then we'll talk about the 39 steps specifically. And then I want to open it up and hear everything you have to say about the movie, what you thought about it, what questions you have, what you want to know more about. So as I'm talking, if you have questions about what I'm saying, I ask that you just maybe note them to yourself or remember them, and then bring them up when we open it up for the Q&A. So Hitchcock in England. Hitchcock was born in England. He was born in East London in 1899. And it's not an exaggeration to say that Alfred Hitchcock grew up with the motion picture as a medium. At the time when he was born, movies had only been around really for a couple of years, and the average motion picture ran about 40 seconds in length. By the time he was a young man, it was a popular pastime to go to the movies. But the British film industry was, especially after World War I, behind what was going on elsewhere in the world, behind what Hollywood filmmakers were doing and elsewhere in America, and behind what was happening elsewhere in Europe too, in Germany and in other countries. And movie going in England when Hitchcock was a young man was not really regarded as like a posh thing to do. The posh people went to the theater. The working classes, movies were much more a form of entertainment for the working classes. Hitchcock very much went to both. He was an avid moviegoer as a young man, and soaked up what he learned from watching what was mostly American product in the British movie theaters, and learned from the likes of Cecil B. DeMille and D.W. Griffith by watching their movies. He also learned storytelling from the theater. And yet he didn't think about going into a profession in either realm. It very much happened fortuitously in 1919. He was about 20 years old and was working for a telegraph and cable company doing advertising work, writing copy and drawing what we would think of now as sort of graphic design work in advertising, when he read that Paramount's production branch called Famous Players Lasky was opening a studio in London. All these job opportunities were going to become available, including a job of the title card designer, which we have to remember, this is the silent era still, and the text that would appear in the title cards, all the dialogue and the narration would appear in text on the screen. And at the time, it was a job to illustrate those around that the words and add meaning through the visuals. And that's the job that Hitchcock applied for, and that's how he entered the film industry in 1919 and 1920. the studio was buzzing with activity, and many of the people who were helping to establish that studio had come from America. So Hitchcock was from the beginning really immersed in this kind of American filmmaking enterprise and loved it. It's hard to overstate how much Hitchcock loved making movies. And he loved it even in the lowliest position. He made it clear from the beginning to his bosses that he was ready, willing, and able to take on any work that was asked of him that was needed in this, growing studio. He did all sorts of work. He did art. He was an art director on many productions. He was a script editor. He learned about script writing from the people he was kind of apprenticing. He was a production designer and eventually an assistant director. And he later claimed that he never thought about directing because he was just so drawn to the art direction, the production design, the visual art of making movies. That was what excited him. But he did get these opportunities in the mid-1920s to try his hand at assistant directing and taking over for some directors, and really got his first opportunity to direct a feature film in 1925. It's a movie called The Pleasure Garden, and it's available online. You can find it. That's Hitchcock's directorial debut in 1925. It's a really interesting, it's actually very impressive for a directorial debut, especially when you think about the fact that it was 1925 and that the British film industry was behind what was happening elsewhere. You see sort of the planting the seeds of what we now think of as parts of Hitchcock's style, playing with camera angles. There's this dry sense of, British sense of humor that you get. And there's even a murder at the end of the movie, even though it's not a murder story. But The Pleasure Garden was his debut, and he made it as part of a co-production project. He made that first movie in Germany. And that's important because in 1925, the German film industry was at its absolute peak. It was the heyday of German filmmaking. Directors like Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau were making these movies that are now classics of a period called German Expressionism, where directors were doing all sorts of incredible, technical achievements with shadow and light and camera angles. And Hitchcock was soaking all that in as he was making his first movie. And when The Pleasure Garden debuted, it was not a huge hit, but what was noted was that it didn't look like a British film. It looked like an American film, or even with some German influences. It was more, in other words, technically proficient than anything that was being done in England in 1925. And that was kind of always the case in Hitchcock's career. From his very debut, his movies had a more technically proficient look and were more daring in what he was attempting from a technical standpoint than his contemporaries. But it was his next movie, The Lodger, in 1927, which may be a title that is more familiar because it is considered his most famous, maybe his best silent movie, that made Hitchcock a star. He became really a celebrity director in England in 1927 with The Lodger. And The Lodger is a movie that we look at today and say, oh yeah, that's Hitchcock, because there's so much about it that sets the tone for he later said it was the first time he exercised his style. It's a story about a serial killer, a Jack the Ripper figure who has a very particular look about him, and someone who looks just like him shows up at a boarding house in London to rent a room, and suspicions begin to brew about, oh, is he the one that the police are after? And it's the first time that we get this theme that you can draw a direct link to the 39 Steps from The Lodger, because it's a theme of the wronged man, the man who happens to be the target of a police investigation, even if he's not actually the killer. It's also, The Lodger is also the first time that Hitchcock made a cameo appearance in one of his films, and that is something we can definitely talk more about too. And he played with all these technical innovations. So The Lodger set him on this path to sort of glory in England. Yet, even though it's a story about a killer, and that's what we think of when we think of Hitchcock movies, he really worked in all sorts of genres in this early part of his career, in the late 1920s and early 30s. He was making romantic comedies, he was making dramas, melodramas, even a boxing drama. I mean, there was a whole wide range of genre, playing around that Hitchcock was doing in this time. It's a really interesting time in his career. But what we need to just think about when we think about this, what we need to focus on, is the fact that he honed his craft and he learned how to be a director in the silent era. And that's so important to remember about Hitchcock's career, because he always had one foot in the silent era, mentally. That's kind of a weird way to put it. But he always was insistent that silent movies are what he called pure cinema. In other words, that's what movies are, that's what makes movies unique. Theater has dialogue. We don't need dialogue in order to be unique. What makes movies unique is the visual storytelling without sound. And he always came back to that if you think about some of the most memorable, some of the most powerful moments in his work well into the sound era, most of those could be accomplished without any sound at all. The shower scene in Psycho, there's no dialogue, right? The crop duster plane chasing Cary Grant in North by Northwest, it's all the visual storytelling. Jimmy Stewart looking at his neighbors in Rear Window, we don't need any talking. So the training in the silent era very much shaped how Hitchcock tells stories. When you think about for the 39 Steps, for instance, one moment that comes to mind is the moment when the farmer is sitting at his dinner table and he's saying grace, and he's looking at his wife and he's looking at Hannah, and she sees the headline that the police are after him, and he sees that she sees, and all of this is, and the farmer's meantime thinking that they're having an affair. All of this is done without dialogue. So the silent filmmaking, the visual storytelling, is a defining aspect of Hitchcock's work. And yet, even though he loved and preferred to work that way, he didn't, resist it when sound came in. He was the one who directed the first British talkie. In 1929, his movie Blackmail was the first talking picture feature film in England. And that is a murder mystery, and that is something that continued to kind of define his style. But even though that was such a prestigious kind of momentous thing that he made this first sound film in England, his career really didn't take off until 1934 with the movie The Man Who Knew Too Much. You may have seen the remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much. If you don't know the original, it's the only movie Hitchcock eventually did remake later with Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day. But in 1934, he made this movie that was a spy thriller, and it was his first foray into espionage thrillers. And it was the first movie he made that really did make a splash in America with American audiences. And it's the first movie that also importantly introduced this plot device that he would come back to over and over again, including in the 39 Steps, called the MacGuffin. The MacGuffin is just a term, it's kind of a made up, ridiculous term for the thing that sets the plot in motion. You can also think of it as the thing the spies are after. It doesn't matter at all, except that it gets us going. So in the 39 Steps, it's this like formula for these air ministry plans. That's the MacGuffin. We don't care what it is specifically. The point is that the bad guys want to get it out of the country and the good guys want to stop it. And that gets us, by the time the plot is off the ground, we couldn't care less what it is. And that was first introduced in The Man Who Knew Too Much. Later examples, like in North by Northwest, there's this microfilm that's in a little statue. That's the MacGuffin in North by Northwest. I mean, it doesn't, you almost forget about it because it's not important. But that is the style that Hitchcock began to develop in this time. And the success of The Man Who Knew Too Much enabled him to make the 39 Steps. So now we get to the 39 Steps and where it falls in his career. And this movie was based on a novel by John Buchan, who was one of Hitchcock's personal favorite authors. And he the beginning of his career in England, he was often adapting stage plays, because obviously like the London stage was very, had a robust, material that was very well known and was easy to bring to the screen. But Hitchcock always preferred adapting books, because he later quipped that, the movie producers had definitely seen the plays and knew them well, but had never read the books. So he felt like there was more creative freedom for him to just take the material and make it whatever he wanted it to be. And that's what he did with the 39 Steps. He, including the title, has a different meaning in the movie than it does in the book. In the book, they're actual steps. In the movie, it's the spy network. There's also no romance plot in the book. That was entirely Hitchcock's invention. There's no character even resembling Pamela, Madeleine Carroll's character. And some of the most memorable aspects of the movie were Hitchcock's inventions. The scene with the farmer and his wife, he put that in there. The character of Mr. Memory was based on a music hall performer that Hitchcock saw on stage as a boy. So these were all, ways in which Hitchcock really made this material his own. He knew from the beginning, in terms of casting the movie, that he wanted Robert Donat to play the role of Richard Hannay. In his English period of his career, in these first 2 decades of his career, so much of Hitchcock's casting inspiration came from his own attending theatrical performances. So he would watch the actors on stage in London and keep them in mind or think about them from their stage performances for when he was casting his movies. In Hollywood, different story, and we'll talk much more about his Hollywood career next week, but screen tests were much more the norm in terms of how he found the right actors at that point. But Robert Donat was a major London star at this point, and Hitchcock knew him and admired him from his work on stage. And Donat had just started making inroads in movies at the time. In 1933, he played an important role in The Private Life of Henry VIII, which was truly the first big, prestigious British picture to be a huge hit in America. And followed it up with a Hollywood film, The Count of Monte Cristo, which he starred in. Donat did not like making movies in Hollywood. He much preferred to work in England, in part because he could continue to perform on the London stage. But the 39 Steps elevated him to a whole new sort of strata of movie stardom in England and in the US. But it's worth noting that, just a few years after this, 4 years after the 39 Steps, he starred in Goodbye, Mr. Chips in 1939. And in the most competitive Oscars year, arguably in Oscars history, it was Robert Donat who won the award for the Oscar for Best Actor, beating Clark Gable for Gone with the Wind, Jimmy Stewart for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Laurence Olivier for Wuthering Heights. So this began, the 39 Steps really brought Robert Donat to a whole new sphere of his movie career. In terms of his leading lady, Madeleine Carroll had been in movies a little bit longer, but this was really her best role up to this point. And she would the next year go on to star in Hollywood movies too. Hitchcock later referred to her in this movie as being the first Hitchcock blonde. And we can definitely talk more about Hitchcock blondes because this was a trope that he would come back to over and over again. But he thought of Madeleine Carroll as the first. She, side note, went on to star in his next movie, which is also a spy thriller called Secret Agent. And I personally love that movie. I would definitely include it if we were doing a third movie in this series. I just realized, or just discovered recently that it's available to stream, I think on Amazon Prime. If you want to check out more Madeleine Carroll, that is Secret Agent is the name of that movie. And she co-stars with John Gielgud. It's very, very similar to the 39 Steps in the sense that it's also an espionage thriller. John Gielgud is her co-star. Peter Lorre is in it, and it's one of his greatest, I think, most hilarious performances. And Robert Young also. So that's a really fun one. But so she and Robert Donat had never met each other until the start of this, until the first day of shooting on the 39 Steps. And Hitchcock, depending on whose account you read, he either had like a delightful sense of humor or like a sadistic streak, but he was a big practical joker on his sets. And he went for it with with bringing his two stars together for the first time. He decided it would be a good idea that to have their first scene together be the one where they're handcuffed together and, you know, climbing through the Scottish countryside. So he cuffed them together and they walked through the whole scene. And then Hitchcock pretended to have lost the key to the handcuffs. And he went off to go do something else. And he left his co-stars, who had never met each other, cuffed together. And this was, I mean, it's hard to know what he was thinking, but one of the things that's been argued is that he wanted them to kind of get into the right spirit of their characters, where they are frustrated at being chained to one another. And that definitely came through. But they got to know each other. And when the ice was, I guess, sufficiently broken, Hitchcock, you know, miraculously recovered the key and uncuffed them. But handcuffs are definitely a preoccupation in Hitchcock movies. He was equally fascinated by the like criminal element as well as the like intimacy sexual element. And so the handcuffs come up in one Hitchcock movie after the next, something to pay attention to. And then another example of his sort of sadistic streak was that in the scene where Robert Donat and the farmer's wife, who's played by Peggy Ashcroft, who's a great London actress, they were there doing their scene together. They couldn't stop making each other laugh. They were cracking each other up, and Hitchcock couldn't rein them in. And so eventually it's like a, you know, famous anecdote from this production that he went over to a light bulb, one of the set lights, and smashed the bulb with his fist, and that brought the whole tone back down, and he was able to continue with the scene. But so I'll just say a word about the reception of the film, and then we'll open it up to discuss. At the time in 1935, when it premiered, when the 39 Steps premiered, in America, the only person involved in the production who was really famous was Robert Donat, not Hitchcock. Hitchcock had, you know, made a splash with The Man Who Knew Too Much, but it was the 39 Steps that made him a celebrity in the United States as well. It was widely regarded as his best film to date. Hitchcock himself even always thought of it fondly. What he particularly liked about this movie is what he called the rapidity of the switches. He loved that he planned the movie as a series of short stories, one after the next. And if you think about it, you go from, like, for instance, Hannay jumps out of the police department window, and then he's in the marching band line, and then he's dragged into the assembly hall, and he's brought up on the stage, and he's giving a political speech, and then he's brought off stage, and he's chained to the woman, and they're in the back seat, you know, and it just goes on, and one thing after the next, after the next, after the next, and the rapid fire transitions Hitchcock really loved about this. And the 39 Steps really did be the beginning of his transition to the next chapter of his career. We'll pick up with that next week when we talk about The Lady Vanishes, but it really did establish not just his name, but so much of his style, the spy thriller, the wronged man, who's both being chased by the police and chasing the bad guys to clear his name. And, you know, obviously being assisted by an icy blonde who eventually, you know, thaws. So much of what we think of as Hitchcockian was really established with this movie. So I would love to hear all of your thoughts. I see that the chat has already been buzzing. I'm going to open it now and see if there are some questions that have already come up, but now's the time to add anything that you'd like to know about, anything that you would like to share about what you thought of the movie. So let me just take a quick glance. We have insight into why Hitchcock puts himself in a fleeting cameo in his movies, and when does he begin doing this? That's a great question. So, like I said, his first cameo appearance was in The Lodger, which was his second movie as a director. he always insisted that that was just like a practical thing. He needed another body in the scene, so he was there. It's not a consistent thing that he does in the British part of his career. It's not even the consistent thing that he does in the beginning of his the Hollywood part of his career, but he does periodically show up in his movies. It was kind of early on, it was like a wink to the press who recognized him. And it evolved into a little signature of his. It later evolved into something a little bit more problematic, because people in America, definitely starting in the 1950s, looked for him, as we do now so often in his movies. Audiences couldn't wait to see where would Hitchcock's cameo appear, because they got more creative and more interesting, especially in the Hollywood portion of his career. And what that led to was the fact that it would often take audiences out of the moment if they suddenly saw him. So he started to, you'll notice as you get later in his filmography, his cameos come way at the beginning, because he wanted to get it out of the way so that people could get into the movie. In like North by Northwest, he shows up at the end of the credits, so of the opening credits. So as you get later in his career, it became something that was so much his signature, but he tried to avoid having it break the spell. Cutting his teeth in the silent era, because I'm opening the chat, by the way. If you open the chat, I went up to the top if you want to see the questions with me. So interesting point about his cutting his teeth in the silent era, because in the 39 Steps, what's most striking is the brilliant use of sound. Yes, absolutely. Like I said, he directed the first British talkie, which was Blackmail. And he played with sound even from that movie. If you've seen that movie, one of the most memorable sequences is this woman who is being blackmailed for murdering a man in self-defense, but she killed him with a knife. She is so consumed with her guilt over the crime, and a neighbor comes to talk to her, and the neighbor's babbling and babbling and babbling about the murder that she's heard about, and she keeps saying the word knife. She's, I can't imagine he's been killed with a knife. That's such a terrible way. But what Hitchcock did was he played with the sound the same way he played with the visuals. In his very first talking picture, what you hear is like knife, 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 and so the sound is the soundtrack of how the character is experiencing hearing this person babble, and all she can think about is the knife that she used to kill this man. And so even from 1929, he's using sound in a way that was way ahead of his time. And in the 39 Steps, absolutely, the brilliant use of sound. I'd love to hear examples of what you thought, but one that really comes to mind is when the landlady or the cleaning woman, I think she is, discovers the body of Annabella Smith at the very beginning and screams, but she just opens her mouth, and what we get instead is a train whistle. And we cut to the train that's taking Hannah into Scotland. So that, again, he's playing with that sound, absolutely, from the very beginning. Scene, yes, absolutely, yes, and sound, and then to silence, absolutely. Rapid classic cuts in the birds, watching the flame follow the trail. Yes, no music. Yeah. Another example of just the visual storytelling in the birds. There's a ton of that. Was Alma blonde? So Alma is Hitchcock's longest collaborator, his wife. Alma Revel met Hitchcock. She was an editor and writer working also in the British film industry in the 1920s when she and Hitchcock met, and they started working on movies together really from the beginning of his directorial career. And she was the most influential figure in his entire career, his most important collaborator. She has a credit on this movie for continuity. That was just a general term really in practice for the fact that she had she was the last pair of eyes on everything. It was her word that mattered more than anything else. She contributed to the scripts, she contributed to the editing, she contributed to the casting choices. Everything really went through Alma too. Was she blonde? She was like, no, she was sort of a light brown haired woman. But she was a really, really important figure in his life. We can certainly talk more about her. Oh, and Chris, thank you for sharing that Secret Agent link. If you want to stream that movie, that's available there. It is a bad print, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just catching up with these here. Such an entertaining, well-paced film, but plot-wise, no. Yes. Why did he even go to Scotland to do what? He planned so much before filming started. Yes, yet he didn't fix huge holes in the script. That is something that you can probably apply to most of Hitchcock's movies. Hitchcock did not care about logic whatsoever. He often commented on that plausibility and logic was not important at all. What mattered was the effect and the emotional impact that a moment would have. And so he talked about this in one interview after the next about how if you go through any movie and you look for absolute plausibility and logic, what you get is, if you're really hitting all those boxes, is essentially just a documentary. He said that drama is life without all the dull bits. And so he would ignore any criticism. He said, if a critic comes and watches my movie and only looks for the plausibility, that person is probably a very dull fellow. And that's not the thing that he cared about whatsoever. You can do that. You can go through, if you take a step, and he also, this was his favorite thing to say, is that by the time the audience is starting to think like, did that make sense? They've already left the theater and paid for their ticket. So you don't care about that. Was it shot on location in Scotland? Great question. No. There was one scene, I guess, one moment that was shot, which is the bridge. English audiences would recognize as the bridge leading to Edinburgh. So the one that the train goes across, that was actually footage of the actual bridge, but the rest of it was shot in the studio. And that caused a huge problem apparently when the sheep came onto the set. All those sheep that were there ate up the sets, and that drove Hitchcock crazy. Why didn't he take writing credit for the 39 Steps or most any of his movies? That's an excellent question. Hitchcock wrote on every single one of, I mean, he had the, he could have taken writing credit on any of his movies because he contributed to the writing on all of his movies very, very thoroughly. But often Hitchcock movies were written by a lot more writers than the ones who get credit. He was a very, very collaborative storyteller. And a lot of times he would bring in somebody to help with the initial, plot treatment, somebody to help with the dialogue, somebody else to help spruce up this part of the dialogue. So a lot of times you're not seeing all of the people by any stretch who really did write the movie, but he didn't, for Hitchcock, the writers deserved the credit for having written the script, and he was very gracious about that, and did not take credit. He really didn't take credit as a screenwriter. Alma often got credit as a screenwriter, but Hitchcock did not. Amazing that it's Hitch's 22nd film. Most modern directors don't get to make that many. That's true, especially in the first part. That's a unique part of his the British chapter of his career. Early on in his career, if you look at kind of what he did in 1927, 1928, 1929, he was making a lot of movies every year. And part of that had to do with the fact, this is like a weird historic note in England at the time, but England was concerned that the American film industry was going to dominate what British audiences were seeing and what British filmmakers could do. So there was actually a law that was put into place in, I think it was 1927, that made a quota for how many British films had to be made. And so what you get in the 1930s is a lot of what were referred to as quota quickies. It's exactly what they sound like, films that were just kind of rushed to meet this quota of British production. And that's another reason. First of all, it's why Hitchcock made so many movies early on in his career, in the end of the silent era and beginning of the sound era. But it's also why a lot of filmmakers just didn't emerge in this period as being incredible, directors and auteurs and filmmakers at the level of an Alfred Hitchcock, because so many of them weren't, given the resources and the opportunities, and didn't rise to the occasion to make something more than a quota quickie. But in Hollywood, his output slowed down because he was making 2 pictures for this studio, and then that was the whole year, and then it would be a new year and he would make 2 for another studio. And so it is his 22nd film, but that's also because he made so many early on. This movie seems unique among his movies with a bit of romantic comedy between the leads. Yeah, I think that I would argue that Hitchcock's best movies have comedy woven through them. He had a great sense of humor, and that does come through. But it has been said that the 39 Steps at times reads as kind of a slapstick screwball comedy, I should say, which I think is a fair thing to say. Question: he worked from storyboards in Hollywood. He said to keep away meddling executives. Did he heavily storyboard early in his career in England? No, is the short answer. The process of storyboarding, if you're not familiar with it, is to sketch out in little rectangles what each shot looks like. And Hitchcock worked with artists like Saul Bass and other artists who sketched out what he described each shot would look like. And that is a process that really evolved in his Hollywood career later. But he did always sketch out the most important visual moments, whether they were rougher sketches or in-depth, more storyboards. He very much did sketch early on in his career. Like I said, he entered the industry essentially as a graphic designer, doing visual art, doing sketches. But the real in-depth storyboards came later. Curious about the wrong man theme. These questions are so fantastic. You guys, I love talking to you. I wish we could be talking out loud, but I apologize for just reading these to you. I'm curious about the wrong man theme throughout his career. Is there any speculation on what in his psychology would have propelled him in that direction? Part of it is just that he was drawn to books and plays that brought that theme out. There's an anecdote that he loved to tell that it's like such Hitchcock lore that the credibility of it, we can't verify. But when he was a child, and every time he told it, he was a different age, so we don't know. But when he was a child, his father sent him to the police station down the street with a note, and he had to hand it to, he had done something bad, like some minor childish offense. And his father sent him with a note to the local police station, and he had to hand it to the policeman. And the note apparently said, "This is what we do to," or the note was given to the policeman, and the policeman locked him in a prison cell for 5 minutes and said, "This is what we do to naughty boys." And so this is something that apparently lingered with Hitchcock for his whole life, that you can put as much stock in it as you want, but the idea that he was punished too much for a minor offense, that he was terrified of the police his whole life, that policemen figures in his movies are always wrong and getting it wrong, and people to be afraid of. But the wrong man, I think, more to the point, Hitchcock loved the idea of a chase in a movie, and the idea that so much of the drama and so much of the impact that a movie would have would be because somebody is being chased, and a good reason to be chased is, that adds a level of suspense and drama, is because you're being chased for something you didn't do, and so you have to doubly chase after the truth in order to clear yourself. I thought that the female character that was killed had a map of Scotland. Yes, right. That is why he went to Scotland in the first place. But why Scotland? It's, you know, part of that was drawn from the book it was based on. Wondering if his espionage themes in this and Vanishing and Lady Vanishes hinted at British involvement, yeah, or lack of involvement against Nazism. Yeah, so we will talk about that more with the Lady Vanishes, definitely. But it is important to remember that in the mid-1930s in England, you know, the possibility of war with Germany and the possibility of, and the just explosion of violence that was happening was a real thing. And that impacted his interest in telling in spy stories. Hitchcock was not particularly political outwardly, although he did very much contribute to the British war effort. Really in his nature to make message pictures for the sake of making a message picture, but he did, you know, he tapped into what was relevant. He definitely read newspaper headlines to draw inspiration for his movies over and over again, especially in the 1930s and throughout the war. Thought it was really clever how the farmer's hymnal book saved Hannay's life when he was shot. Yeah, that's right out of Hitchcock's mind. I mean, that was very much his own touch, not in the book. In the beginning of the movie, Annabella asks if she could come home with him, and he says yes. That seemed pretty risque for 1935. Yeah, I mean, we have to remember also that the Hollywood production code really didn't apply in England. That Britain had its own censorship laws and whatnot, but not like what was going on in Hollywood at the time. Hitchcock's battle with the Hollywood censors is a whole thing to talk about in terms of his Hollywood career. He pushed the limits often more than anybody else. Did Chaplin have an influence on him? The description of Hannay going from one incident to another, yeah, like City Lights or Modern Times. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, Hitchcock was such an avid moviegoer. He did not often talk about actors impacting him. When he talked about his influences, it was always directors. He placed directors as the highest, you know, as the be all end all. I mean, he even equate, you know, he said the director is the god on the movie production. You know, directors were the ones who made movies, according to Hitchcock. It wasn't so much the actors. And I know that Chaplin was, you know, also directing his pictures, but he didn't think of the performers as being the ones who, you know, influenced how he made movies. The contemporaries at the time who were influencing him the most were the likes of Cecil B. DeMille and D.W. Griffith. The sharp graphic black and white shapes are very striking. The triangular mountains and scenes seen through parallel vertical bars on a chair, right out of his German influences. That was what the German expressionist directors were playing with. You know, stark black and white, shadows, interesting camera angles. Do you have any insight into his style of macabre and suspense? If you could clarify that, Joel, just a little bit more, I would love to answer that question. Maybe what are you specifically referring to? If Hitch learned the use of sound while working in Germany. He was working in Germany before sound came in there, so but he definitely picked up on it when he would see those movies in the theaters.
I'm interested in the origins of that style.
Yeah, of the macabre. Oh, thanks, Joel. Great. Well, the macabre definitely in terms of his German influences. When we think of German movies like Nosferatu, these were the movies that he was seeing in Germany, or that were coming out of Germany, that had a much more dark macabre style. He was interested in that. Oh, in terms of suspense, also, this was very much, and the idea of being fascinated with crime, this was not unique to Hitchcock in his time. England as a whole was fascinated morbidly with crime, and criminals and figures like Jack the Ripper. I mean, this was something that everyone in his society was just like, like his characters are. They're just fascinated with murder. You see it in the 39 Steps. People are seeing, oh, another woman was murdered in a London flat. Like that was how his, people around him in England at the time were just so excited by that. And I think that definitely impacted his own interest in it. I would have loved to see Leslie Howard in one of Hitchcock's films. Yeah. They didn't work together, partly because Leslie Howard, when Hitchcock came to Hollywood, Leslie Howard was really interested in going back to England to help with the war effort. So their paths sort of cross. The 39 Steps appears to have provided the template for North by Northwest, absolutely. Hitchcock called North by Northwest the American 39 Steps. It's so similar, right? Even down to the idea that the man, Cary Grant in North by Northwest, is found holding a knife in a guy's back, right? That he didn't put there. And the same idea that a woman has a knife in her back in this guy's apartment, and then all of a sudden they're bopping about the country, right, on a chase to avoid being caught by the police and to find the spy to clear their name. It's the same thing, right? It's just set in the US. Can we talk a bit about the early scene, the music hall, with everyone panicking and running out of the theater? That reminded me so much of German Expressionists. Absolutely. There is a scene that I can't think of, actually, now that you say that was in a music hall. I will come back to that, because there is a scene that I'm thinking of that you're absolutely right. Love the comedy, the romantic comedy of the two leads, of course, with the many bits, the two guys talking ladies' underwear on the train. I'm so glad you brought that up. That so the bra salesmen, right, on the train, who are talking and showing the latest models of their ladies' underwear line, and the priest is over there on the other side of the train car. And Hitchcock was raised in a devoutly Catholic home. And so his Catholic sensibilities come up in his movies a lot. And I'll ask you to pay attention to that in The Lady Vanishes when you watch this movie for next week. His take on Catholic figures and just religious figures in general in his movies is always sort of tinged with a little, I mean, not always, there are some examples that are more somber, but very often there's an irreverent approach to them. So for instance, you have this priest there, but he's like, checking out the ladies' underwear that these men are holding up, right? So look for how a religious figure in The Lady Vanishes is treated in an irreverent way. And we'll come back to that for next week too. Hitchcock seemed to like to make his audiences think about the possible romance between characters, right? Hannah with Pamela, where she takes off her stockings, with Annabella, with the farmer's wife, who's accused of sleeping with Hannah. Yeah, sex totally fascinated him. I mean, that was something that just came up in his movies over and over and over again, and was something that, in terms of it fascinated him, like I said, both in terms of just the dramatic possibilities, but also in terms of the way that sex and intimacy and romance often was so blurred with violence and crime in his movies. So, there's always a threat around it, and suspicion of, can you trust this person even though you're intimately with them? It was something that he would come back to over and over again. I'm sure you can think of examples in his other movies, right? I mean, the most jarring is Psycho, right? Where he's just so like aroused by this woman who's shown up and spying on her in the shower. And then, you know, we know how that ends. The political meeting and his speech in the great music hall banter, right? And then the fight, this is his funniest film. It's definitely got so much humor in it. And there's a lot of humor in The Lady Vanishes too. So we can pay attention to that as well. Right, these are such great observations, taking off her nylons with following her. These are moments that are so out of Hitchcock's mind. I mean, we could have seen, if you think about this moment that you're talking about, she's got to take off her wet stockings, but they're handcuffed together. So you could, if you go back and watch that shot, he could have shot the whole, you know, them in a wide shot. You could have seen them together. What he focuses on, he takes the camera real close and follows the handcuffs down her leg and back up her leg, and he doesn't know where to put his hand, and he puts his hand on. That's where the drama is, and that's where he knew where to bring his camera, because that's what we're really all looking at anyway. The Firth Bridge, yes, right, that's the recognizable landmark. Notice many overhead view from above shots of the actors, yes, which seem to telegraph the sinister tone. Again, this is something that his contemporaries just simply weren't doing at the time. These playing with these camera angles, in England, I should say, playing with camera angles, the more, you know, elevated shots looking down, and something that he would continue to play with over and over again. The ending shot is incredible. I totally agree with you, John. If you go back, if you just watch that last like 10 seconds of the movie, what you see in the composition of the shot, and this is what I mean, there's always more to Hitchcock than we even see in the first viewing. The last scene, you see Mr. Memory, who's dying, you know, getting lower and lower onto the floor. Scotland Yard is just beginning to appreciate that they've been wrong all along. And you see that figure kind of looking back and forth. Then you see the chorus girls going on with their number in the background, even though this man has just been shot on stage. And then in the very foreground, you see Hannah and Pamela, and they begin to hold hands. And so much is told just in this little shot that it's indicative of what was to come with Hitchcock. Was it typical to feature gun use in English movies? I think of that as an American fixation for sure. The weapons varied in his early English movies. And in fact, in The Lodger, it's like all these different, the Jack the Ripper character uses all these different methods of murder. But like I said, in his debut, The Pleasure Garden, there is a murder, and it is with a gun. And there is a very, very incredible shot of the gun and the victim off in the side. And he was playing around with kind of how the murder weapons were shown on screen. I find it interesting that just like in the Thin Man movies, one doesn't really care much about the people who get murdered in Hitchcock films. Yeah, there are a lot of bodies in Hitchcock films that pile up of innocent people. And one of the things that does, especially in his spy thrillers, is show kind of the just the real danger. I mean, to anybody could get swept up in these horrible plots. And so, you know, depending on whether it's an espionage story or just a small town, you know, kind of maniac who shows up in some of his other films, there's always this danger that innocent bystanders could be kind of brought in, characters we might not care as much about, but they're there anyway. Madeline Carroll is maybe the first Hitchcock blonde, but she's treated more roughly than most Hitchcock blondes, dragged around by Hannah. Yeah. Yeah, I would argue other than Tippi Hedren, who I would say is treated the most roughly of any of Hitchcock's blondes. Yeah, Hitchcock also liked to test the limits of what his actors and his colleagues would endure in terms of his wicked ways. And he really, he pushed her. I mean, he was able to kind of show her as getting, you know, all bedraggled going through the countryside in the water. And that's how she had to appear on screen, this glamorous woman. I think she still looks incredibly glamorous, but you know, she was a good sport about it, and she liked working with him. Not every actor liked working with him, but she did. And like I said, she returned for his next movie. Yeah, people asking Mr. Memory questions couldn't work now. We have Google. It's true. The ending shot, yeah, of the two hands is similar to the ending of his earlier film, The Ring. That's the boxing drama that I mentioned. Hitchcock said, and this, again, this is something to note for The Lady Vanishes, that plagiarism is style. That was a quote of his, which I love. That style is defined by taking things that you've done and doing them again, right? And building on them. And so if you see, this is something we can come back to next week, if you see tropes in The Lady Vanishes that you saw in the 39 Steps, that's Hitchcock, you know, repeating himself, building his style. Thinking Hitchcock film with 2 tickets to the theater in London, it was quite a surprise to see the billboard say London's funniest theatrical production. I'm not sure what you're referring to there, if you could clarify that. And of course, are there multiple meanings of 39 Steps? Just in the book, they're literal steps that lead to the spy organization. Holding hands at the end, he's finally won her over. From their opening scene, yes, when he aggressively assaults her, yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's a great point. The sort of trajectory of that, he does. He just goes in and kisses her on the train, and then he slams the handcuffs on her. I mean, this is a very aggressive beginning to their relationship, and then it goes to this much more tender place at the end. Yeah. Wow. So that was an incredible chat that you guys all added in. But I would love to hear if we have time, Chris. Yeah, or whatever you think. I'll send it over to you.
Sure. Well, I just want to say bravo, Hannah, for talking pretty much for an hour straight and answering all those questions. That's incredible. We are at an hour. And yes, that was an incredible string of questions and quite the wealth of knowledge that you shared with us all. I don't know if anyone, we can give Hannah a chance to, again, have another sip of water or catch her breath. Yes, what does cause pip in poultry? We have to say that at least 4 or 5 times, right, Remy? Well done. Well, adding those in.
Yeah, thank you. I did actually look that up.
Oh.
That's a ridiculous thing to know about, but apparently it's some sort of like tongue problem in poultry. I don't know. That's more of an answer than Mr. Memory gave, so I'll leave it at that.
Does anyone have anything, any closing notes, anything anyone would like to add?
Oh, I just saw something come through. Where would you rank the 39 Steps among Hitchcock's 1930s British films? Also with The Lady Vanishes, and you prefer Sabotage. Yeah, Sabotage isn't, we can think of these as being in a string in the 1930s of all of these spy thrillers that came one after the next. The Man Who Knew Too Much, The 39 Steps, Secret Agent, Sabotage, The Lady Vanishes. I think, I mean, personally, I think it's definitely one of his best British films. I read somewhere that the BFI ranked it in their 100 top British films. I think the poll was done like in 2000 or something. The 39 Steps was ranked number 4. And The Lady Vanishes was also on there. And yeah, any other questions? Something came up earlier about Madeline Carroll in another one of his movies. I'll just add that Robert Donat never made another movie with Hitchcock, unfortunately, because they loved working together. Like I said, of every actor who worked with Hitchcock, but Robert Donat was the first leading man that Hitchcock really, really got along well with. Later examples, of course, were Cary Grant, who appeared in 4 of his movies, and Jimmy Stewart. But Robert Donat was like the template for that. And Hitchcock always wanted to work with him again, and just never worked out because Donat didn't really want to go to Hollywood, and he had other commitments. And he suffered terribly from asthma, which often caused him to bow out of productions throughout his life. But he wanted him to be Maxim de Winter in Rebecca, which went to Laurence Olivier, which was Hitchcock's first American production. He wanted to bring Robert Donat with him, but they never worked together again. Yeah. You guys are just absolutely incredible. I'm so excited to hear all your thoughts, and with the Lady Vanishes too. Thank you.
That's a great segue, Hannah, that we will continue this conversation and continue to explore Hitchcock in this British period next week.
Right.
So next Wednesday at 7:30. And thank you again so much, Hannah. This was absolutely incredible. And thank you all for joining us. We'll see you back here next week. It's the same link, so just use the same Google link and we'll see you next week.
Thank
Awesome.
you. Chris.
Thank you.
Hannah.
Thank you guys. Have a great night. Have a great week. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank
guys.
Thank you very much.
It's so nice to hear everyone's voice. I have to shut up more next time.
Good night.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the thing. These Zoom things, you know, you're on there by yourself for.
Things was good, or should I get off?
It's leaving. The Bateses are still there.
If I hang up, it's going to hang everything else up. So I'll just say goodbye, Hannah. And
Bye, Chris. Thanks again. This is so
Thank you.
great. Thank you.
Bye.
See you next week.